Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Andrea Piero, and I'm the director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the start of our spring lecture series featuring Chicago-based artist Brendan Fernandes, who is internationally recognized for working at the intersection of dance and visual arts. I would like to thank Brendan for taking the time to share his work and expertise with us this evening. I am grateful for his partnership, his enthusiasm, and for all of the preparations that have gone in to bring us together tonight. SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a variety of public talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars each academic year to expand our thinking about contemporary art and culture. In addition to public programs, our guests meet with SAIC students through various engagements, and we look forward to hosting Brendan next week for a workshop and meetings with students. Just a couple quick notes about the format for tonight before we get started. I would like to ask you to kindly silence your cell phones at this time, and to please note that video recording is not permitted. At the end of the presentation, we'll have time to take 3 or 4 questions from the audience before the program concludes by 7:30. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and our staff will circulate microphones for your use. We ask that if you are posing a question, if you could please keep it concise so we can get to as many questions as time allows. So thank you again for joining us, and now I'd like to welcome to the podium Andrew Falkowski, Assistant Professor in the Department of Painting and Drawing at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, to introduce Brendan Fernandes.
Okay, good evening. Thank you all for coming. You know, I'm really excited to see Brendan talk. I've actually never seen him in person, so that's something I'm really looking forward to. The Munch Art Museum in Oslo, Norway, the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, the Richmond Art Gallery in Richmond, British Columbia, a public mural at the University of Buffalo Art Galleries in Buffalo, New York, the Hellenic Parliament in Neon in Athens, Greece, Palexpo in Rome, Italy, the Lurie Gardens in Millennium Park, Chicago, Illinois, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, and the Fee Foundation in Montreal, Quebec. This alone is an impressive list of projects in and of itself, but if you were to Google Brendan and look at his website, you'd find that this is only a small portion of what he's done over the last several years. Brendan Fernandes is incredibly prolific. Brendan Fernandes is a 5th-generation Kenyan of Indian heritage. His family immigrated to Canada in 1989. He studied and he performed ballet in his youth, and he moved into performance art subsequently after that. His work resides at the intersection of dance and visual arts. He is a multidisciplinary artist who examines issues of cultural displacement, migration, labor, queer subjectivity through installation, video, sculpture, and dance. He is a graduate of the Whitney Independent Study Program and a recipient of the Robert Rauschenberg Fellowship. Brendan is also the recipient of the Arcadia Award, a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, and his projects have also been shown at the 2019 Whitney Biennial. These are just a few of his accolades. He's also an academic. He's currently an assistant professor in the Art Theory and Practice Department over at Northwestern University. So this is a remarkable career, but this isn't actually how I know him. He's a friend. We bonded goofing around in the halls at Northwestern University when I taught there, between classes, sometimes during, organizing open houses for the students, kicking around ideas in graduate crits, and hanging out at the end of the semester with the graduate crits, as I mentioned before. I found him to be committed to teaching. He's curious, he's supportive, and he's always very, very busy. What I've experienced firsthand about Brendan is that he has the rare ability to make connections with people. So for instance, Brendan, a ballet dancing queer punk rocker, is so well liked by his students at Northwestern that some of his students, Division I football players, have been known to bring their team-allotted fruit snacks and cherry juice drinks to share with him in class. So at first glance, this seems odd. What can they have in common? And in a lot of ways, they really are different types of people. But when you look a little deeper, what they do have in common is that they all have rigorously trained their bodies and their minds to perform. The commonality of performance is what brought them together. Brendan saw that in them, and they saw that in him. So what I've seen and what I think about Brendan and what he does so well, both naturally and with concerted effort, is that he finds common ground. He finds rapport. And I've also noticed that within my own personal experience with him. He's helped me out in many different ways, and I him, in part because we find the sort of humanity that connects us. He does this in the classroom, as I mentioned, and he does this in his work. He collaborates, he feels the politics of the room, and he understands how bodies navigate, or more specifically, perform their way through these spaces. More pointedly, he investigates the social demands institutions put on bodies to determine our collective cultural architecture. And, perhaps more importantly, he finds the humanity that connects us to that and to each other. So for Brendan, this interplay is consistently rooted in collaboration, which in turn fosters solidarity. So, with this in mind, please give a warm welcome to my friend and my studio mate, Brendan Fernandes.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was very kind and very generous, and thank you for everyone to be here. I do a lot of talks, and I don't get nervous, and I was thinking, why am I a little nervous today? And it's because I'm speaking to my home city, Chicago, and so I'm very grateful for everyone to be here. I know I can feel the energy and vibes of, close community, and so thank you for being here today. I just wanted to start off the talk by kind of going through some of my earlier work and sort of talking about the foundations of that. And I titled the talk, "We Came to Dance," because as we move through some of the questions, the concerns, the places that we're in currently in the world, I think about dance as a political material, and I want us to start out with that and the beginnings of my space with dance. So this is a slide of a piece that, kind of my work always sort of stems within a space of protest, of gathering, of collaboration, of finding community to move together. So I will also use that kind of language of how do we move? How do we move forward? How do we turn around actions, performance through action? But to begin, my earlier work started when my family immigrated from Kenya to Canada. I'm a fifth-generation Kenyan, Kenyan Indian, and my family left Kenya under political circumstances to come to Canada. And in Canada, when we left Kenya to move to Canada, we started to bring with us artifacts, souvenirs, mask objects. And I was really curious about the mask object as a cultural signifier, quote unquote, Africa, that kind of historic monolith that the space has been put under, but also this kind of idea that we were leaving as tourists and bringing these things that we didn't have in our homes, and so kind of questioning the idea of homemaking, authenticity, where do I belong? And so this piece I made actually years after I stopped dancing, so I'm kind of going in and out of the dance narrative. So I started dancing in Canada when I was around 9. My parents put me in an outreach class for immigrant kids to learn dance, but also to find a way to be taken care of after school, because they didn't have that space for me. They were working, and so they put me in a dance class. And little did I know that that would be the place that I found community. It was a thing that took care of me. I had friends, I had other dancers, and I learned about community. And I also was good at it. For the first time, I felt I was finding a place that I was enjoying it, and I was actually finding something that allowed me to excel. I wasn't, the kind of student that in Kenya who loved to play sports, or I wasn't good at mathematics. I was kind of just I found it in the arts, and it was really honed when I moved to Canada. So I'm going to kind of just hold on to that, and I'm going to continue onto this kind of work. So when I left Kenya, my family started bringing these things. So I started really questioning the idea of the museum display. How are African artifacts positioned in the museum collection? How are objects being, taken from their place of origin and then being stilled? So then I started to think about the dance narrative to these objects. All of these objects come with a movement, a performance, a dance, a ritual. And as we've taken them out of their place of origin, put them into the museum, a Western hegemony, we've taken away their purpose. We've taken away the body. So in a lot of my work, I'm thinking about the ways that we have to implement the body back into these objects through that colonial narrative of dismantling that space. This piece was an early piece that I made in New York when I left Canada to move to the United States. This was 2004 when I started the Whitney Independent Study Program. So again, being displaced, finding a new place of belonging, a new space of existing. And our studios were on Canal Street, and I started noticing that West African vendors were selling this particular mask on the streets of Canal Street as a New York souvenir. So how is this object that now is quote unquote an African object being now sold as a New York souvenir? And something that's interesting for me about this object in particular, you can find them in many curio shops or vendors are selling them, and it's sort of a stand-in for this cultural monolith of Africa. But this mask is based on a Maasai male warrior's face. And I can tell this by the stretched earlobes, the kind of headpiece. And the Maasai are Kenya's nomadic people. But in our tradition of East African culture, we don't have masquerade. So within this question of authenticity, I'm also questioning this idea that this mask has been made up. It's become a signifier of an African space, but it doesn't exist. And so within this, I'm always sort of questioning my sense of identity as, being Kenyan, being Indian, being Canadian, being Kenyan, being queer, being a ballet dancer, punk rocker, as Andrew said. Subculture is also a big part of how I identify, but how that idea of identity doesn't have to be static and placed. We can allow it to be something that germinates, that transforms and challenges itself to constantly be in reinvention. And I will talk about that in other things. This is another piece that I did working with the mask vendors. I always say my work is process-based because, and that was my Canadianism if you didn't hear it, process. It's process-based that they kind of projects lead from one to the other. So with my work on Canal Street, it kind of led me to this work where I was doing interviews with mask vendors, asking them questions about who they are, who buys these objects, just curious about the idea of the artifact in the museum and then the souvenir being sold on the street, why the differences, why the cultural space of creating value through commodity, through economy. So this is a piece where I was doing a show at Art in General, which was a non-for-profit space off Canal Street, but I was also doing a lot of research at the Met, looking at the provenance reports, the reports of objects that were being, of African objects that are losing information. So whenever you look at an African object, like at a museum, for most of the time, we do not have a name of an artist attached to them. And so these three objects come with an artist attached to them. And in the provenance report, it'll say, artist, master of Buli, brackets, possibly. And in that space, there is being given an identity to this object. And how they've identified this object is Western historians are reading carving gesture as like how you'd read handwriting to say these objects are made out of the same kind of wood. The carving looks like it's similar. So let's give this person a name. And so within that, I'm also questioning the idea of authority. Who gives the power to name somebody? And also this idea of authority in the sense that, we give them the name, and we give them the name with authority, the master of Buli, brackets, possibly. So that kind of like oscillating idea of identity, which is also kind of circulating within my sense of identity and many other people as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about mask objects and the kind of colonial narrative, and then kind of looking deeper into it through the narrative of dance. So this is a photo series called The Insiders, and working through my practice, I have had privilege to be able to talk and work with historians. I am an artist, I'm not a historian, but I get the privilege to work inside collections. And a way that many masks are being authenticated by historians is to look for the lived experience, to look how the mask was once worn and once performed. And so this series of photographs looks at the idea of photographing the inside of the mask. And how are we looking for those secretions that might have stained, patinaed the object so that we know that they were lived. But then when we take them into the museum context, we take away the body. So I'm making that that differentiation between the lived and then the stilled. And stillness for me also is a political space within performance, and I'll talk about that as well as we kind of go into this intro from the colonial dance process to other narratives of specifically my ballet life. And so I've done a lot of interventions, performances in museums, working with collections. This is a piece called In Touch. And looking at rules and regulations of museums, we're choreographed in our everyday. We're told how to move. We're told how to move specifically in museums. We're told how to move through spaces. So I was looking at this was a commission through the Seattle Art Museum, and I was looking at how objects in that museum, one of the rules of the museum was that you can't point at an object. And I was like, well, that sounds really bizarre. Why? And they're like, well, if you point at the object, you might touch it. And so that's a rule of the museum. And so I was like, that's an interesting thing, because also within our social etiquettes, pointing is confrontational. So pointing is rude. It's being deemed as something that you don't do. And so I was thinking about this. And so this piece starts unannounced as an intervention. The performance sort of happens. If you happen to be in that space, you see the work. If you don't, it disappears. But I have a dancer, a trained dancer who is from the same region and tribe as this object, which is from Cameroon, who walks into the space and acknowledges the object. And as he acknowledges the object, he starts to kind of create this relationship that we were once together. We were once a part of each other's lived experience. And then he starts to point at the object. And that starts the choreography until he then shrouds himself with the costume and then sort of dances around the object, trying to mimic, to put the object onto their body, but the museum apparatus, the Western stand-in for the body, the plinth, doesn't allow him to go into that space, because we've deemed that rule that you cannot enter that space. And so I've been thinking a lot about this, and he ends the piece by bowing to the object, unrobes, and walks away, almost as in a space of like, I have labored, I've given this action, I now need to let myself go. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, and coming now deeper into the ballet kind of narrative that I'm going to bring into my talk. Ballet began as a way to bow to Louis XIV. Within the court of Louis XIV, the gesture of being choreographed when you approach the king teaches you how to bow or tells you how to bow to him. And again, the higher you are in the courts, the more shallow the bow is, but the lower you are into the king, the deeper you bow. And those gestures became gestures that were then adopted and tuned to become the dance of the kings. The different courts within the European continent started to adopt ballet as the dance of the kings. So the French court started it, but then you have the Italian court, and you have the Russian court, which is the most formed form of dance of ballet as it is now. So sort of moving forward, I'm thinking about this idea of freedom within restraints within my work. And so ballet became, as I mentioned, a community, a space of engagement for me, a space of solidarity in a certain way. And my family put me in that outreach class, and I kept on dancing, and eventually one of my dance partner, her mom was kind of like my dance mom. She picked me up from school, she got us ready, she took us there. My parents were working, and she eventually auditioned me and her daughter Nancy for the National Ballet School of Canada, and we got in. And my parents were like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm going to ballet school." This is maybe 12 or 13, and they're like, "You have to go to school." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm going to ballet school." And they were like, "No, you need to study and get a job." And I was like, "Yeah, I have a job. It's going to be a ballet dancer." And that was very, I think for Kenyan immigrants, it was a challenge. And so I like to challenge my parents. And I had this chutzpah, and I kept on going. And I started to perform and train and think that this was going to be my life. This is a piece called As One, and the As One series is sort of looking back at that kind of narrative of ballet and the colonial narrative. And so within this, as I mentioned that the ballet dancer started through bowing. These dancers are bowing to the object, giving their body almost to the mask. And within that, it's about an apology, it's about a reconciliation, but it's also about hybridity. It's also about this kind of splicing of the body where the ballet body becomes the body of the mask object. And so it's sort of playing in this space. Of course, it's also black and white in the way being photographed is referencing like, Stieglitz or even like Picasso's studio, that kind of idea of the exotic and the primitive, and this kind of two spaces coming together. And so I kind of do this a lot in my work, playing with the idea of the bowing gesture and then the conflation between the mask object and the ballet body. And when I sort of moving into this idea of desire and mastery through ballet, like when I watch this, or look at this, and it's my work, but I look at the bodies of these dancers and how they're so specifically trained, and those sort of like specificities of how a body is augmented and manipulated in a technique like ballet. And eventually the ballet world was sort of like, we like your neck, but we don't like your feet. And I was like, okay, so the ballet world never liked my feet. I have very long feet, not like that long, but like long-ish. They're long and narrow, but they just don't have the arch. And when you're performing in dance and ballet, you show your foot, and it's nothing about strength or fortitude or endurance. It's about an aesthetic that has been adopted to be seen as being beautiful. And so within that, I was being told, well, we like this about you, but we don't like this about you. And it was sort of like, maybe you should think about other dance forms or other ways of performing. And so within this idea of freedom within restraint, I'm thinking about, these ideas of, so I used to use a foot stretcher to perform, maybe when I was 14, 15, to bind my foot so I could give me the arch. So that's a foot stretcher. And I started to think about, later on, and that's how you kind of use it in class, because it also gives you this nice little moment where you can rotate your hips, you can open out your hips, because ballet is all about rotating your hips and dancing from your turnout. So years later, I stopped dancing when I was around, so I left the ballet world and I started to train in modern dance, because modern dance was the othered form of dance. Leave ballet, dance in modern, because Martha Graham technique is about if you have hair, you can let it down, you can dance barefoot, you're in parallel. But Graham is also a very rigorous technique, and it's very hard on your body, and I actually got injured in Graham technique. But I was sort of thinking between those two forms of ballet and modern dance, how do we have these restraints, these kind of restraints that put like physical pressure, emotional and mental pressure too, on yourself and your body, and what does that mean? So years later, after not dancing and not even talking about dance and focusing on that colonial work, I started to make work with bodies again. And this is the first piece I ever put myself in, and it's called Standing Leg. And Standing Leg was where I was, feeling very vulnerable, and I proposed it to the Contemporary Art Museum in Vancouver, and they're like, we love it, come for the summer and do this piece and workshop it. And basically what I did was, I put on my foot stretcher after 20 years of not performing, and I wanted to do the gesture of me coming back and doing the solo of giving my body to an audience, but performing the act of standing up. That political gesture that I have somehow metaphorically fallen, but how do I stand up? And if I'm in this restraint, this device that's sort of holding and controlling my body, how do I stand up? The other aspect of it is that I'm holding on to the object. I'm the one that's in control here. I'm the one that can let go. And so I've been thinking a lot about the masochistic qualities within our art form, and the ideas of how do we let go? How do we let go and stand up? And so that becomes something that will be reoccurring through other works. And so this piece, I only performed it 3 times because it's that painful, and I decided that I'm not that much of a masochist anymore, and I will let go of it. But it was this idea that I would wear this device, like I would sleep with it, I would try to get my feet. When I watch ballet, I only look at feet. I have this like desire to look at feet because I'm like, oh, that dancer's feet are perfect. I'm not looking at their arms, I'm looking at their feet. But I've been thinking about this idea of this dynamic of power, but also this idea of social political space of standing up. And so moving into other work, this was my piece that was commissioned by the Graham Foundation in 2018, and Ellen is here today, Ellen Alderman, who was the curator of the show, and it then traveled to become my piece at the Whitney Biennial. And what I was doing in this work was thinking about the mastery of form, the mastery and technical body of ballet, and how does that function, within the system of who is the authority, and so, and questioning the dancers themselves as they're performing. So instead of using the foot stretcher, I made 5 devices, I call them devices, that are full body torture devices, medieval devices, I don't know what you want to call them, but they're like kind of also aesthetic, they're beautiful. And so I have 5 of these sculptures, and the dancers are moving through a sequence, a choreographed sequence, through this kind of what I call a BDSM playground, and they're finding ways to do these different situations that I've asked them to perform. And within it, it's also questioning authority, agency, space, collaboration. So when I work with them, we talk and we make space. We create space for them to understand what is possible and what is not possible. And the choice is always up to them. So this kind of seemingly austere device is the cage. But after performing in different devices like this for 30 to 40 minutes, they're allowed to go into the cage, or they go into the cage, and this is the space to release, to rest, to allow the body to rest and fatigue less. But working with ballet dancers, they hated this space. And they hated this space because there's freedom in this space. They were like, well, what do we do here for 20 minutes? I said, you can sit on the ground, you can move, and they're like, but you need to tell us what to do. This is a weird space for us. And that's something that I started to become accustomed to, is like, as a person now who works with dancers, and I'm not dancing in my work anymore, and that's because I got injured and I'm old and all of that kind of stuff. It's awkward for me to, in the beginning, to tell people how to move. Like, that's a very intimate thing to do, a personal thing to do, to tell people how to move. And so when I'm working with my dancers, they are my art material. They're giving me their bodies, their souls, their minds, and so it has to be an intimate conversation. It has to be this. But when I was training, it was like, you do this now. And so we do these things, and eventually they understand the method to my madness, and they see the kind of space that I'm trying to create through agency and finding solidarity for them to feel that they're also engaging. So it's always a collaboration in that way. And so in this piece, we kind of move through it. So they start off in these devices, there's 5 of them. They go into the cage, and then there's a moment with the ropes, and then they kind of continue back into the cage. And in total, we did this piece at the Whitney Biennial, I think 120 times, and each time it's 5 hours long is the duration of the piece. And I was like this showing this picture because that's Amy, and I can just tell she's like, I'm really mad at you, Brendan, because she's probably had to this is after 5 hours. And the thing is, again, I always say to them, like, if you want to take off your shoes, because the women identifying dancers are wearing pointe shoes, I'll say, they'll come up to me and they're like, can I take off my pointe shoes? And I was like, you can do whatever you want. I've set the piece, and now it's yours. If you want to take them off, take them off. And one of my dancers, Allison, she was like, I'm taking them off this one. And I was like, okay. And then I went and watched. I watched the whole 5 hours. Allison's on full point doing the work. And after I said, I thought you were going to take off your pointe shoes, she's like, yeah, I just wanted to see if I could. And I said, but you can. And she goes, well, I wanted you to say yes, but I would never dance not in my pointe shoes. Like, I don't look good otherwise. And I was like, and that's that kind of like masochistic quality where it's like, it's almost like a battle with yourself as well. And I think about that through like mirror stage, through Lacanian theory, but I also think about it through that peace of mind where I'm holding that device, I'm holding myself in that foot stretcher, and it's 2 hours, and I'm feeling the cramp all the way up my back, and I'm in pain, and I'm like, just let go. Just let go, Brendan. And it's this thing of like, I won't. And so thinking further through this idea of freedom through within restraint, I did this piece called Ballet Kink at the Guggenheim, which was part of, and it's still an ongoing research space, thinking about when a body is augmented or challenged, whether it's like a physical augmentation or challenge, but whether it's also like a societal issue or challenge, how do we move forward? How do we find new forms of understanding and being to make change socially, politically? And so this piece, looks at BDSM community, BDSM culture, but also the kind of idea of ballet culture, dance culture. And so kind of melding the two, we created this space in the Guggenheim, which was basically a dance party slash, sex club at the Guggenheim, where, we had tons of people coming and observing me tying ballet dancers with other shibari rope masters to kind of augment bodies, to see if two bodies are tied together, how do we move together? And if one body's not in sync, how does that affect another body to fall? So you have to kind of be in touch with each other, to have that intimacy, to have that space of understanding what does it mean to kind of like challenge a way that we've done things. So like even when I talk about like the etiquettes of the museum or the etiquettes of like, going to a theater, like a ballet theater, why, let's rupture those spaces. Let's challenge those spaces, I'm not saying to leave here and go touch art objects. You can do whatever you want, but I'm just saying we need to find challenges. I recently did a piece in Copenhagen, and I asked them, because it was the first time I did something on stage, it was a piece with a choir, and I asked, can we not give programs out? Let's give programs out afterwards. The dancers and the musicians will come off stage and pass a program out to somebody as a gift, as a gesture, and then they can learn about the work afterwards instead of seeing it in the beginning. And they were like, that cannot be done. And I was like, why? They're like, because it's never been done. And I was like, well, let's try that. We're in a very precarious time in this world, and for me, where I think we need to find other ways to do things, and a gesture like that might sprue other ideas. And so in this work, I'm thinking about how is the tying of the dancers supporting new forms of movement, new gestures that could become technique, that could be other ways to kind of like move the body. And I also like this piece, because like, if, when I'm thinking about moving, like when I'm dancing, like, like there's a certain sense of like effort and labor that goes into everything. When you're watching a dancer on stage, from this vantage point of a proscenium, we dehumanize the body. We don't actually fully accept or understand the physicality of what the body's doing. And so if my leg is up here and I'm holding it, that's endurance, that's labor. If it's tied up and it's being suspended and I don't have to think about that labor gesture, I can move something else and physically activate another part of my body. So I'm sort of thinking about that as well through this piece, about how is that freedom found through this restraint. And restraint, again, through a physical rope restraint, but also kind of thinking metaphorically through societal issues, but also through like ideas of like, just a mental conceptual thought space as well. So we talked a little bit, or I talked a little bit about modern dance. So after my ballet life, I started to train with Martha Graham. I got injured in Martha Graham. And so, but I was still, I took this time off from dance. And when I came back to it, and that was when I moved to New York, I started thinking about these things. Never taking classes, maybe one or two, but the trauma was still there. I was like, I'm just gonna make other people dance with me. And so I was invited by the Noguchi Museum to do an intervention in their space. And it was a 3-year process of research. And I started looking at how Noguchi made sets for Martha Graham. And I was really curious about those sets. And one of the things was that he made, I'm gonna try this little handy dandy pointer. He made this, yeah, that's so funny. He made this 2-dimensional chair for her. And it was for a ballet called Appalachian Spring. And in Appalachian Spring, Martha Graham sits on her chair, and her female identifying characters were always in this like really deep like hardship space. So they would do this position called pleading, which you like plead with her hands and like kind of putting these gestures. And but this chair was a two-dimensional prop. So what I decided to do was work with architecture firm here based in Chicago, Norman and Kelly, who also worked with me on the piece at the Whitney Biennial, and I created 6 chairs based on Martha Graham's chair from Appalachian Spring. And my dancers, sorry, jumping forward, or backwards, sorry. This exhibition opened as a show between me and senior curator Dakin Hart called Body Space Devices. So all the objects that Noguchi created that asked for the bodies to be a part of it were in this show. It was up for 6 months, and then slowly I started to build my apparatus, so the scaffolding and bringing in my chairs. And then it became this kind of like hybrid show. Is it Noguchi? Is it Brendan Fernandes? Is it Martha Graham? And within this, we started to think about the dancers sitting on these chairs. And my way of starting the choreography was that they sat in the chairs in a position contraction. So in Graham technique, you contract your muscles, and then when you release them, that's where the gesture comes from. So the show is called Contract and Release. And so the dancers are sitting on the chairs. So the original chair doesn't rock. My chairs rock. So they sit in the chairs in contraction, so using their abdominals not to let the chair rock in these pleating arm positions, and they have to hold it for as long as possible until they fall out of the chair. And that's what starts the choreography of this piece. So my dancers said to me, we have really strong abs after this show, and I said that was my goal. But I love that this idea is that, like even in this picture, you have Tiffany dancing on my chair, but then you have these other sculptures by Noguchi that are referencing body, and it just became this like really weird hybrid space. And I like that people were like, is that you or is that Noguchi? And for me, that's kind of queer, that the space itself is also queer, that it's not defined, it's self-identifying, it's self-actualizing, and it can be different things. And so we had 4 rooms, and then this other room where Noguchi sculptures that were based on biomorphic forms of movement and dancers, he created these objects that were kind of placed together. And I remember watching the installation team working with, and this piece here is called Gregory. I remember seeing the installation team working together almost like in a dance, where they were moving to kind of like place the pieces together to assemble it, because they're slate, they're big pieces of slate, and if they moved it at the wrong time, it would then snap. And so I was thinking about that, and then I used maquettes that they would use to install for practice. I got my dancers to kind of play with them and create new Noguchis. So their bodies become like side by side with other objects, and they kind of started creating these like tableaus, like almost historical art tableaus where they're making new Noguchis. So again, this idea of new form, new objects, new ideas of how to make things different. And so I'm just sort of jumping through all of this life of mine, because I guess I've been dancing a lot. In between the moments of ballet and modern dance, in New York, the club became a space for me. A space, again, to be with other queers, to find freedom, to find sanctuary, to just go and exist. The Vogue ball scenes in New York were a big part of my community. And I started thinking about this a lot. And then one summer, I think it was 2015, I started with a dancer of mine. I was just curious because a good friend of mine, Lauren Post, was dancing with ABT, and I was watching her performance, and she fell to the ground. And when she fell, there was this huge gasp in the audience, and we knew it wasn't like a theatrical fall, it was that she had fallen and hurt herself, and then she was just dragged off the stage, and I was just kind of like, really like taken, and I was sort of thinking about that, and she tore her ACL, and there was this whole situation. But then I started thinking about like falling. Again, I talked about like standing up, in my piece, standing leg. But how do I choreograph falls? How do I choreograph falls? And I didn't know why I was doing this. I just was in the studio with a dancer from Ballet BC, and we were choreographing falls. And I was playing this game, a game of call and response. So dance, 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 fall. And then we fall. And we sort of would realize that you have to crumble your body. You have to kind of like break from like joints to kind of like feel like, okay, I'm gonna fall and then fall. And then we started to like figure out like how to stand up again and what that would mean. And then the summer of 2026, when the Pulse Orlando massacre happened, I was just taken. A space that felt was my space for me and my chosen community was infiltrated and the massacre happened, I was like, I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel good. And then I started thinking, 49 people fell. 49 people fell to the ground and did not stand up again. And I started thinking about then my choreographed falls. And so this is Free Fall 49 that was at the Getty Center that was first performed in Monique Melange Gallery as a kind of a test, but then it became this larger performance piece at the Getty where, I hired a DJ, and I've done this a number of times, and I kind of stop and think about this because I kind of want this piece not to be relevant anymore, but it still is, and it's really hard because our community is still being challenged with violence and gun violence, but it's an homage, it's a celebration, but it's a reminder that our work is not done and that we have a lot of work to do to get to a place of, solidarity. But in Free Fall 49, I have a number of dancers. This iteration was 49 dancers on pedestals, dancing in the court for a free Friday at the Getty. And DJ, here's my friend DJ How to Dress Well, and we create a dance set. We ask people to come dance with us. We perform as go-go dancers, and then there's a sound cue, and every time the sound cue happens, we all perform that choreographed fall, and we fall to the ground. And there's this moment where the party stops. And the first time people are like, what's happening? Did something happen? People start to laugh, there's this moment, and then we pull up the music again, and we start to dance again. And there's a count up, that we count the numbers from 1 to 49 to give a stop, a break, an homage to each person that fell. But, it is a celebration. We stand up again. We get up and we keep moving. And for me, that is the political resonance of that work. It's like we have to keep going. And it's always really kind of hard and tough work, but it's the work that we have to do. And I remember at this first time we did it, at 47, 48, we had 5,000 people in this space, and everyone just sort of fell to the ground and laid there. And we're all laying on the ground together, 5,000 people, which felt really powerful, but then also you're like, what is this space of emergency, this space of urgency, and how do we kind of challenge this? And then the music comes up, and then there's this cathartic moment of just crying and hugs, and everything kind of happens. And so Free Fall 49 is a very personal work for me, and it sort of continues into other works like this piece called Steady Pulse, where I think a lot about architecture and space to create space. And so the dancers use the space, which is an open storefront in Soho, where they recreated the space every day. And so thinking about the dance floor as a space of resistance, whenever I work with my dancers, I ask them, they always ask me, what's the floor made out of? How will this floor penetrate my body after I've labored on it? So if I can feel this floor, how will it come into my body afterwards? And so that is also a political space, that the dance floor is a space of resistance that gathers, that brings people together, but also a space that its resistance allows the body to labor and endure. And so in this space, we created these floorboards in skin tone palettes, and they have these kind of this foam on the bottom that allows them to dance on them a little bit longer. And so every time they would come into the space, they started to reconfigure the space, reimagine the space. There's coat hangers, because I kind of use coat hangers as body indexes, so there's always 49 to kind of think about the 49 that did not leave the space. And also, the uniforms are a collaboration with the Rational Dress Society, which is a part of SAIC, and they became these really kind of fun, kind of playful costumes, uniforms. But when a dancer wasn't there, it hung in the space, and the choreography was to nurture it, to care for it, to fold it, to hold it, almost as another body. And the piece was, something that kind of happened for 3 months, every day for 3 days, and it just sort of became its own kind of thing. Eventually, I had to just kind of watch my dancers take it over, and I like that. After I give them we have our beginnings of learning, and a lot of my choreography is based on tasks. I give tasks and proposals, and then they kind of take it on for themselves. And I really think that there's something really intimate and beautiful to sort of see it kind of grow and change and challenge. And so Steady Pulse became this thing, but Steady Pulse also became a place where we had conversations. So we'd reconfigure the boards to kind of we had an artist sort of lecture series, and then we'd have dance parties once a month. And so it became this kind of like oscillating space that was always changing. And one thing that was also part of it was the dancers were able to choose the music that they performed through from different playlists, but they had to start with a song by the Whisperers called The Beat Goes On. And for me, that song is a song that gives me joy, that fills my body with motion and action, but also something that really questions the idea of like the beat of the music, the violence, the beat of the violence, or the heartbeat continues. And so I want to play with that. And then I'm just going to go over a couple other things really quick because I know I'm talking for a lot and you guys want to ask me a question or two. But I recently made a film called, based on the Pulse Orlando piece called Free Fall 49, and this is Free Fall for camera. And in my work, I'm also thinking a lot about how the camera itself is a device that choreographs. The camera is a device that captures. The camera is a device that moves. And so I was thinking about Falling Again and how Busby Berkeley created these beautiful kind of like glamorized bodies that were fallen and kind of like dancing to this in this kind of like biomorphic kind of shape. And so within this piece, I've been working on that idea of those kind of choreographic patterns, filming from above, but then eventually also fully filming from above where they're kind of creating these kind of patterns. And the camera is like moving through and almost touching the body, and the dancers are still. But there's a movement that comes from the registration of the camera's motion. And so movement coming from another place as well. And in the piece, there's moments where bodies fall and they carry and they caress and they nurture. There's a lot of ideas of picking up, supporting, taking on each other's weight, and so forth. And so Free Fall 49 is sort of coming from that. And then the last section of my talk is sort of thinking about moving forward queer futures. And I did a piece called On Flashing Lights, and thinking about, a lot of my work also comes from this idea of police abolition and who protects my body, who sees my body as being visible, and how am I protecting my community. In Toronto, in around 2016, again, 2017, there was a lot of issues between the queer community, the queer POC community, and the police, where there was a serial killer that was not being found, but it was killing the community. And there's a big festival in Toronto called Nuit Blanche, and they asked me to do something, and I said, if I'm gonna do something, I wanna create a dance party. And they said, well, you can't use city money to throw a dance party. And I said, okay, well, I wanna do a light and sound installation. And they said, yes, we can do that. And so I hired 24 police cars, take that back, 24 cars from a movie set that were used as police cars. I took away all the geographic locations. I didn't want to have locations on the cars, so they're just white cars with sirens attached to them. And so I'm gonna use this handy dandy pen again. And over here we built a DJ set, and I hired 8 queer identifying POC DJs to create this light and sound installation that faced City Hall, and we danced to the lights of the police sirens. So it was from dusk till dawn, different sets, and people came. We had about 10,000 people come. The police themselves were like, we don't like this is gonna create a riot, there's gonna be this whole thing. And they just drove around us, and I was like, great, you're adding more animation to my party. And so it became this thing, but people gathered, people came and wanted to dance. And it's not like a trained dance, like a ballet dance or a modern dance technique. People just wanted to move their bodies together. And it was this celebration, again, this idea to think that, we're celebrating, we're gathering, but then why am I dancing to the lights of police cars? What is that implication? That kind of tension of like, okay, something needs to be considered here as well. And so the piece was, that City Hall, and it went from dusk till dawn, but I really was so invigorated by the idea that crowds of people came to move together. And I think about also dance for me, I said it started in a ballet class, but when my family as Kenyan Indians, when we celebrate, we dance. All our holidays end up with a dance party. And so thinking about that, I made this piece in the pandemic. I was, 20 was hard for all of us, and I was thinking about this idea of how do I make work in a moment when I can't be with people. And my work is about touch, it's about intimacy, it's about gathering, and now we can't even be together. And in this moment, I was like, I need to be resistant, I need to be resilient, I need to find ways to do things, even if it's, again, out of the norm, out of the ways that I've never even thought about. So that idea, again, of a new form. And I'm like, I'm doing this, using this thing called Zoom a lot. And I remember like doing a Zoom class, and one of my students had a filter, and I was like, wait, what's that thing behind you? She's like, oh, you can use filters. And I'm like, okay. So I started working with a graphic designer to make filters. And if we're all in the same filter, but in different spaces, are we in the same space? What's the safe space? The screen is now the safe space. And so I created this dance called the Left Space, which was pretty choreographed, and I actually just performed it in Montreal. And for the first time, we actually showed the dancers doing it, because before, every dancer was in different spaces, and now we're all in the same space, and then we're transmitting it through Zoom and projecting it onto buildings and stuff. So just kind of ideas of like, how do we then like let the work also leave and become different things in other places, and what is a performance, and what is dance? And so I started working with this pattern, which is a Maasai fabric that is super hyper visible. The color pattern hurts the eyes, so Maasai male warriors wear it at night, so when they, it wears off predators, so the color pattern is hyper visible. But then when we put when we put the filter on and we kind of move our finger across the camera, it creates this glitch where the body starts to come in and out. And then, so you're watching dancers like doing this and kind of moving their hands, and it looks really like ridiculous. And it's in silence when you're seeing them perform, but the output is almost like something from a nightclub or the club. It's like this kind of like oscillating kind of like pulsations of different filters, and we kind of have this thing. And so I like the idea that we can see things differently. You see it in the Zoom space, you see it in the live space. So again, finding other ways to see things, other ways to be seen or not seen. And I've been thinking a lot about a space of being invisible. If I'm invisible, have I found my civil rights? Have I found my spaces of solidarity? Do I not need to be seen and heard? And as I said, dance for me is a political material. Dance for me is a space to gather people, but it's also a way to be seen and to be heard through a space of protest, to find that freedom. And so if I'm invisible, does that mean I don't need to be seen and heard anymore? And perhaps that is a space, but we're not there as yet. We still need to work that labor, to stand up, to fall, to stand up, to fall, to get to that space. And so within the left space, I'm questioning that. What is left after this moment of pandemic, which we're still working through these moments of social uprisings where we're thinking about bodies of color still being, killed? What is that space left? And left coming from the idea of a leftist space, a social space, a space of finding solidarity and freedoms. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, and I've been making more works. This is a piece in Greece where I ask you to imagine things. So I ask the audience to imagine without fear what is tomorrow, and then to come and write on these outdoor spaces, on these outdoor dance floors, what does that mean for you? To give me your release. We're holding a lot of tension and trauma, so to imagine tomorrow that marks this idea of imagined freedom, what does that mean to write it? And then the dancers would perform it and kind of read that as script, as score, and make gestures to kind of think about other people's releases. And that came for me from this moment where I was in a dance studio in Los Angeles in, I think 2025, sorry, that's not even now, 2015. 2015, I'm looking to the future. I'm thinking about where, during the AIDS crisis, people would write the names of people that they knew who died in that pandemic. And so that was kind of a way of coming back to us asking my audience to write their releases. And thinking forward, I'm thinking about gardens. Gardens as spaces of public gathering. Gardens as spaces of safe spaces. Gardens as an ecological system that supports certain plants grow at certain ways to kind of allow for a certain plant to be taken care of. And this was a piece with Stephanie Cristello, who's here, and again with Ellen Alderman, called 72 Seasons, where we performed different dates from the Japanese seasonal calendar, but thinking about, again, this idea of nurture, care, to tend, to go back to the land, to go back to a space of beginnings. We have to rethink the spaces that we're in. And what that means. And for me, I think this was a piece that was really coming out of the pandemic, out of this moments of social uprisings. The summer of 2020, when I would put my mask on and walk the streets of Chicago, marching for Black Lives Matters, that was important, but I think we need to do more of that. We're still living through these moments. And so the 72 Seasons is looking at gardens, at spaces of inclusivity, support, nurture, care, tending. And so there was these poems within the space as well that kind of talk about the labor, the land, the tending, the nurture, the care. And I'm gonna go one last project. This is a new piece that I just did in Oslo. And I was asked to come to Oslo last summer to make a work for the city at the Munch Museum. And during that research, there was a mass shooting at London Pub. And I was seemingly on my way there, and I'm just like, this is happening everywhere. And I'm just like really taken by this. And I left Oslo to come to Chicago, and then a couple weeks later, there's the 4th of July shooting in Highland Park, and I'm like, we need to stop this kind of work. We need to be more activists. And I think something else I think a lot about is that, there's words, but we need to perform our actions. And so I really want to kind of embody that to performing our actions is something that's really important. And this piece was performed in a round glass amphitheater. I asked my audience to watch it from outside. The dancers are in the space. It's a collaboration with a lighting designer, so lighting as architecture, but within the space there's curtains, so again, visibility, invisibility, what do I see, what do I not see, and the dancers are in this space. There's an 8-channel sound piece that kind of has this kind of audio sound of voices calling and asking to be seen, to be heard, to be invisible. But again, challenge the way we see performance. The audience watches it from outside. And again, I will end with this piece, Invisible, but really wanted to question the idea of social spaces of solidarity, questions of how do we see each other in the future? How do we want to be seen in the future? And I hope for a better space of collaboration, community, support, tending, and more dancing together. So I'll stop there. I just realized I didn't take a sip of water in that whole hour. I think there's some questions, perhaps?
Yes, please raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, Nancy?
I also am interested in merging dance and visual arts in my future. I was wondering how you found a balance between the two in a way that honors them both.
Yeah, that's a really hard question, but I have an answer, and I'm not sure it's the answer that you want to hear. I think for me, I was always told, especially in the ballet world, that I had to pick one or the other. They're like, you can't be a professional dancer and you can't be a professional artist. And so for me, when I got injured, that was the moment of we broke up. It was the first breakup of my life. I was like, I don't like you dance anymore. But within that, I focused then more on my visual arts career. And then the way that I could bring it back in, I feel like I found a balance by being a choreographer and a dance maker. I'm not dancing on stage anymore, but I, have found a way to bring it and work with other dancers. So that's kind of the way I found the balance. But that was years afterwards. And I never thought I would ever say that my injury was something that gave me space, but afterwards I could find that space within it. So not saying to get injured, I'm saying that you can find a balance to do it in a way that, find a way, but that's how I found it in my way. That was through doing it more through choreography and then implementing visual arts in it as an intersectional space.
I have a question over here, Brendan.
Oh, sure.
Your narration does such an effective job of animating all the gestures. I'm super curious why you use still photography to document movement versus video documentation.
And I was going to preface that before my talk, but I didn't. And for me, it's more about my flow. And so I know my work is all gesture based. It's more about when I give a talk, I don't like to stop and then look at something. I kind of just want to I want to be dancing up here. And so if you want to see, my webpage is pretty thorough and has documentation of all the work. Yeah, and again, within my work, I always hyper document. I have many ways of having camera documentation, photo documentation, and so it's really important for me because that's how I archive and that's how I reperform, and that's how I also keep track of it for future iterations. But yeah, I did that on purpose to have images versus having actual film because for me, it challenges my flow of how I narrate it.
Garrett?
Hello.
Hello, hello.
I have a question. So earlier you posed a question about how do you choreograph falling, and I immediately thought about the depth drop. And so I know you briefly mentioned ball culture. So I'm curious, will we ever explicitly see, your relationship with voguing if you have one?
Yeah, I actually just did a piece with Jason Rodriguez from Pose, and it was a piece at the Neuberger Museum in not upstate, in SUNY Purchase, and it was we threw a ball. It was amazing, and but also I've been thinking about. So I built these versions of. I've been really interested in making furniture, like chairs and stools, as you've seen, and how those affect and augment the body to be performance devices. So sometimes they're art objects in certain contexts, but then in other contexts they're props. So I made these smaller stools that were inspired by West African headrests. So, and then the dancers are in a collection in the museum, and they're laying horizontal on the floor, and they're voguing up towards the objects. So I've done that. In the film Free Fall, there's a voguing section. I've never used a death drop because I feel like it's such an iconic gesture that also is almost like a glamorized fall. So when my dancers fall, they look like they're hurting themselves, but they're not. They're learning how to do that. But I guess that's something I forgot to mention in my work. I'm really curious about how the body is enacted in a vertical space versus a horizontal space. When a body is moving on a stage in verticality, it's being supported by the floor differently than when it's fallen on the floor. So thinking about that power dynamic between being vertical and horizontal. And so when they're laying on these headrests and they're voguing to the ceiling, it's almost as if they're reaching to the gods or reaching to the higher efforts of the spirits, but also this idea of fragility. The body in laying on the floor is more vulnerable, it's more fragile. And so again, referencing back to that idea of the fallen body. You're welcome.
That's another question up to your left.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really lovely to see. As someone who's both interested in kink and parties, but I was really curious to see how organizing a party like the one you did with the chorus was different than if you would have organized it outside of art institutions. Did you have, I think, more control over making it focused on POCs? Yeah, how was I think navigating organizing kink and POC parties or things that are historically outside of art institutions inside them right now?
I think what I do when I make work like that is I say I am protesting within the system. I'm putting myself into an institution and working within it. So I'm bringing my community into that space and making the change and challenge from within. And so working with queer, POC, kink communities, at the Guggenheim, or it's challenging that Western hegemony of what should be seen or how something should be seen in that space. So I'm finding the change from within that system and bringing in my community and saying we have a space and a place here. You're welcome.
Thank you, Brendan.
No questions from you.
I wanted to ask, because there was the question about documentation, also your relationship to language and text and how you score your performances for future uses. Or how do you sort of make sure that they can live beyond you?
Definitely, and I think like the history of dance, like, as I mentioned, like ballet began in the court of Louis XIV, and in his court, he started writing these bizarre like ballets, and Louis XIV became Louis XIV, when he became king, made his court dance from dusk till dawn, and when the sun came up, he arrived on stage, and dressed up as the sun and promised a new day for his people. And we know Louis XIV did not do that, but that's why he's the Sun King, because at his inauguration at dawn, he dressed in this like huge costume and pomp and circumstance and walks out and says, "I'm the new day, I'm your new Sun King." And so, but that's a little rant. He wrote these ballets, and the language of it was all these kind of like almost these filigrees and scripts and nothing that actually really made sense. So dance lacks a language, and that's something that I think a lot about, that, within the idea of reperforming or archiving or having a document for it, we don't have a language, we don't have a score like we do for music. And so what I do is I kind of, as I said, I use the camera. The camera is a very important device. When I re-perform something, I'll send a document to my dancers where it's just very like rudimentally, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like this, or just watching it so they can learn, and I give them the tasks. I write a lot about dance, and I know this is what we were going at, but I'm really curious. So all of my dances have a fluxus score, a score that kind of like talks about the language that, if I give it to my dancers, we can kind of break it down, but it's almost about that idea of that spontaneity, that idea of like, how does one kind of interpret the dance through that language? And so I'm writing scores, but I also have like my scores that are like videotaped and are very archival and kind of like more, that document allows for difference than the Fluxus score. And I do this sometimes where I write Fluxus scores like again, so these kind of poetics, these kind of like language poetics that I make with graphic kind of like motifs that I'll just say something like, stand up tall, turn around, and become a monument. And I'll make them, and I'll go on the train, and I'll just turn on my airdrop, and then I'll just start to drop them to people. And so if you accept it, you might get a Fluxus score, so you might reject it, but I'm just sort of finding other ways to kind of like let the work kind of like infiltrate and go into the space. But like language is important, and I think that's with the 72 Seasons piece that we collaborated on together. There was these little kind of like placards in the garden that were poetics, but also gestures of how to make motion and actions and movements.
We have time for 2 more questions. I have one in the center here.
Thank you.
Hey,
hello.
Thanks so much for this.
You're welcome.
Can you talk about, is choreographing task-based actions related to your view on labor?
Definitely, yeah. Well, I think labor in general needs to be acknowledged in the physicality of dance itself. And when I said that we dehumanize bodies, we make the body look like it's effortless. And so I think about labor through those actions. I also think about labor through stillness. Like I think about, like, when I was a core dancer, so even like the dance, the hierarchical level, like layers of a dance company. You have core dancers, and then you have soloists, and then you have principals. And within that pyramid scheme, a core dancer will not be allowed to move their body. But then a principal dancer can move a lot more, but even within that freedom of moving, you're still laboring, right? So it's kind of like a fake structure of being hierarchy. But then I think about stillness as an action. So if I hold my hand here for like this, I'm still laboring. I'm still moving my body. My body is still, in its moment of stillness, is still activated. And within, I think, capitalist society, that's seen as being like idle, being lazy, being still. But I remember being in a ballet company and standing like this for like 20 minutes, like holding my body, being like, okay, counting, okay, and now I can move, and I can be here now. And so like the idea of that idea of stillness being labor. But then I think about it through like the workforce. You know, when my family moved from Kenya to Canada, a lot of the labor, a lot of their skills were seen as unvalued skills. And so cleaning became a way of finding ways to make, you know, to income for family, to take care of family. And so I think a lot about the cleaning skills of laborers or other gestures like that. So I have a piece called Clean Labor where my dancers work with cleaning staff of hotels to learn the choreography of how to clean a hotel room. And also the efficiency, like within an hour, you're supposed to clean like 10 rooms. But also this idea that when you clean a room, like a bed, for example, there's a very particular way to make a bed, but you can't show a wrinkle on it, because if there's a wrinkle, it means a body has left an imprint on it. And that means when you enter a hotel room, you're not supposed to have like a sense that another body has been in that space. And so I've done work there and thinking about those kinds of labor gestures as well.
Super cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Very powerful work. Thank you for sharing it. And I just wanted to ask, since your work is so well thought out and it needs to be so well thought out, I was wondering if these ideas really come to you on the train, or if you have people you really consult when you think of these things.
I think my work comes to me in its livedness, in my experiences, in what happens. I think it happens like I think like it's always part of something that's affecting me or challenging me, and I need to find ways to not resolve it, but find hope to resolve it. And in that resolution, I start to maybe bring in other people to communicate, to talk through. And I mean, that's where the collaboration is. But yeah, I think, and as I said, it's process. Like it's always something that kind of like keeps digging and keeps pushing to the next space. And so you can kind of see threads in these projects, and there are some gaps here. But I think, you know, for example, like, you know, I'm thinking a lot about Pulse Orlando, and I said I don't want that work to have any resonance anymore, but I have to still do that work because there's the issues are still coming out in the communities that I exist in, and so I have to keep pushing that. So I think that's more of a question of like the labor that I have to keep doing with my community to get to that space. So it's not that I'm just, you know, thinking it's political action. It's work that needs to get done. And so I am grateful that I can be in a space like this and speak with all of you, and I hope that it allows for conversation and further ways for us to kind of feel connected and then to make those social changes. So I hope everyone voted today. And, you know, because I think we have to kind of think about that, that this is art, but art for me is political, social work. It's a responsibility.
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you.